This fifth module in our program on planning for Ministry of Education officials in the OECS looks at monitoring and evaluation of an education plan, and it has examined several issues, some which are more conceptual, more theoretical in the first section and also through the required reading, and some which are more practical, more technical, such as the discussion in section 2 on the different stages, the different steps in the monitoring and evaluation exercise, and also the selection of key performance indicators, something we discussed in the third section of this module. In this concluding section, I will look at two elements which to a large extent summarize what we have seen before. The first one is looking at some of the major components of a monitoring and evaluation system, and in the second part we will highlight some of the major issues to be examined and to keep in mind when setting up a monitoring and evaluation system. Many countries develop what they call an M&E framework, a monitoring and evaluation framework, and it's a tool that will guide all of the staff in the educational administration, in the different departments in the ministry, but also at school level and the actors that may be between the ministry and the school. It is to guide all of that staff towards a common approach and also to clarify the different roles that each is expected to play in monitoring and in evaluation. And such a framework then, if it's well developed, would describe what is to be monitored and evaluated, what is the subject of our monitoring and evaluation, what are the different activities that we will undertake in this regard. Some of these activities will relate to collecting data, others to analyzing, to reporting. It will also look at what are the sources of data and the different data collection methods that we may use. It should highlight who is responsible for which activities, when these different activities are planned, how regularly and at what time in the year, and it should contain it should give quite some attention to how all of that information will be used and who are the recipients, who are supposed to be the users, the beneficiaries of that information. And therefore, such a monitoring and evaluation framework can be composed of various components which can be grouped under two. The first component would be more looking at the actual process. What are the different activities with a calendar and the responsibilities of the different actors? And second one then, that looks more at the elements that we will actually assess and measure in a results framework, which in many cases will start with a recall of the goals, the objectives, and linked to these goals and these objectives, the outputs, the outcomes, the impact, and for each of those relevant indicators. It will give then for these indicators the baseline, the final targets, the intermediate targets, linked to each outcome and each output. And this is expected also to be a dynamic tool that will be regularly revised. Ideally, every year, there will be some form of review, either to update some of the information. You may remember that we have discussed that for some new indicators, we may not have baseline, and therefore the first year we will collect information so that we can develop a baseline. But we may also see that in some areas we make more progress than expected or slower progress than expected, and that we may want to rethink the targets. Or we may have difficulty to collect information for some indicators, and we may be looking for alternative indicators. That is the M&E framework that can help guide the different actors in the system, and indeed quite regularly when an education sector plan is developed, it will be accompanied by such a framework, or there will be in addition such a framework developed. But we may have such a framework even without a detailed education sector plan. We may have an overall strategy, we may have a policy, and an M&E framework that is a separate document to guide all the different actors. When we develop a monitoring system, when we develop an evaluation system, there are several elements that we need to take into account. And throughout this rather long module 5, we have looked at some of these elements. And here I want to recall some key issues that are a form of summary of the elements that we discussed, and arguably also some of the major points to pay attention to. Some of these will relate to the education sector plan, questions of data, information and knowledge, the different actors, the tools, and an issue related to the supply of information, the supply of monitoring and evaluation information, and the actual demand for it, a point with which I will end. On the education sector plan, you will remember from our discussion in section 2 that in order to facilitate monitoring and evaluation, in order to make it more feasible and also more useful, it is good that the plan has a clear structure with linkages between the different inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact, or whatever terminology your plan may use, activities, programs, targets, goals. But it is important that we have that sort of results framework, theory of change, results chain as it is called, that shows the linkage between our overall goals of the plan, the objectives, the programs, the activities, and different indicators for these. The plan also ideally should have accurate goals and targets. And here again, we have mentioned that these targets are not necessarily always measurable in numbers. They may be targets such as the production of a results framework can be a target. The production of a curriculum could be a target. But of course, many of these targets will be in numbers. The percentage of teachers who undertake regularly professional development training programs. And as we discussed, these key performance targets, these key performance indicators will usually relate more to outputs and outcomes. There may be next or linked to the education sector plan yearly activity plans, and it is important that this education sector plan is owned by all stakeholders, that it is not seen as an exercise that a small team in a particular unit, be it a planning unit, be it a strategic development unit, has created without involvement of the other actors. It is only when the plan is owned that there will be a feeling of commitment to this plan, and that there will also be a feeling of accountability for the plan results. Second issue on the data, the information, the knowledge. And I make a distinction here between data, information, and knowledge. Indeed, what is most important is precisely that the data are transformed into knowledge, and that the knowledge is used to improve plan implementation. And that means that our focus has to be more and more on the analysis of data and not the collection of data. And that analysis has to take the form of collegial discussions as part of a learning process. We made a point that in the education system in most countries we already have a lot of information, that a lot of information is already being collected, a lot of data within schools. Teachers check if students are present or not. We have examinations, we have inspection reports, we have budgets, we have human resource management data, we have of course the school census, schools write regular reports and so on. And there is a temptation to always ask for more and more information, while arguably the need is more to translate that information into knowledge and to spread that knowledge, to learn from what we monitor, to learn from what we evaluate. There are many different actors involved in monitoring and evaluation. We have, of course, those who implement at different levels. School principals implement, district education officers implement, curriculum officers implement, and so on and so forth. We have the decision makers, the chief education officers, permanent secretaries, ministers, and so on. We have possibly, not always, but the beneficiaries. We may want teachers as beneficiaries of the education administration, parents, students, maybe employers. We may want to check with them on their satisfaction with the education system. And that's a positive point, of course, when we have so many different actors, though it could lead to a dispersion of such activities and a lack of coordination, and therefore it is helpful to have a coordinating unit. You may remember the brief discussion on that we need to avoid that as coordinating unit is strong, let's say has strong authority but not much legitimacy, or that it has legitimacy, but not much authority. It needs to be well placed, but at the same time also well resourced in terms of human resources. And at the same time, we have to make sure that all actors draw benefit from monitoring and evaluation information at their level. A point about tools. Here again, there is quite a lot of emphasis on the need to develop tools. We have to develop a results framework. We have to develop a monitoring and evaluation framework. We have to develop report formats. We need to have key performance indicators. We need beneficiary surveys. And indeed, all of these tools, they can be very helpful. But the emphasis on tools also actually could lead to risks. First of all, a tool on its own does not solve a deeper seated problem of, for instance, lack of accountability or lack of commitment. It is not because we have a good report format, or let's use the example of a beneficiary survey. It's not because we have a good survey among parents and that survey provides information that immediately and automatically we will feel responsible towards the parents. We will feel accountable towards the parents, and we will want to improve the situation. In many cases, tools only function properly when the overall institutional culture is present to use them for the benefit and the use that they have been developed for. A tool does not on its own create an institutional culture. It can accompany a strategy to transform an institutional culture, but it will not create it on its own. And we have to be careful that we don't focus so much on tools. They tend to be easier to develop than to change indeed the way people behave. And that's why quite regularly we focus more on the development of tools. We also should be careful that the monitoring process becomes not too time consuming, that we do not spend more time on actually monitoring than on doing the work that is being monitored. And there is of course the risk of a ritual application of these tools. The critical reading that we gave you, the required reading, discussed some of these issues. So to summarize a little bit here, tools are meant to facilitate the monitoring process, to accompany it, to facilitate it. They should not overburden the actors. And the final point is that actually the main constraint to effective monitoring and evaluation, these constraints are not necessarily related to the supply of information, but the demand for such information. We are all to some extent ready to provide some information on evaluation, on monitoring, but we don't like to be monitored, we don't like to be evaluated, and we do not demand necessarily for much of that information. In quite a few cases, the demand that comes from outsiders, be it outside the ministry, even outside the country sometimes, from international agencies, may be stronger than demand which is internal. In many cases also, there are actually greater incentives to continue our present practice than to change. And there are relatively few incentives towards transparency. It is for all of us difficult to be open about the lack of progress that we have made with our work, and there is more incentive to hide that. I regularly make the point that when it is easier to manipulate data than to change behavior, many people will manipulate data and pretend that behavior has changed, but will continue acting as before. So what do we need to do? Well, at the moment, I think many of our efforts are more actually focused on addressing the supply constraints, data collection, development of tools, training to some extent. They focus more on the supply than the demand side. We need to also pay attention to demand constraints. That means focusing more on the analysis of data, on discussing the analysis, and on demonstrating that monitoring and evaluation information is useful and should not be threatening. That monitoring and evaluation are tools or are processes that are intended to guide us to help us improve our work, to help us reach more success, rather than to be a threat and rather than to be a sanctioning instrument. Okay, with that we come to the end of this module. I hope that you've enjoyed it. You still have an individual assignment to complete, and we also look forward to your comments on the required reading that some of you have started commenting upon. Thank you.